Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're going way back to the 19th century to explore the work of John Stuart Mill,
Mhm.
a philosopher whose ideas about liberty and freedom are still surprisingly relevant even in our world today.
Yeah. It's really quite amazing how Mill was wrestling with some of the same big questions that we're still grappling with today, back in the 1800s.
Right, like way before the internet and smartphones and all the things that shape how we think about freedom and individual rights these days.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, let's make sure everyone's on the same page here. When we talk about John Stuart Mill, what are we really talking about?
Well, Mill was a true polymath. He wrote about economics and politics and logic and even feminism, but he's probably best known for his work on utilitarianism and individual liberty.
Okay. So the utilitarianism, that's the whole greatest happiness for the greatest number thing,
Yeah.
right? Like make decisions that maximize happiness and minimize suffering for as many people as possible.
Exactly. But Mill's take on utilitarianism was a bit more nuanced than that. He recognized that happiness isn't some kind of one-size-fits-all concept.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about like, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain in this really simplistic way.
Right. It's not just about maximizing some kind of objective measure of happiness. Mill believed that individuals should have the freedom to define what happiness means for them and then pursue it in their own way.
So he was really emphasizing individual perception and this idea that there are many different paths to a good life.
Exactly. And he believed that this kind of individual freedom was absolutely essential for progress, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
That makes sense. I mean, if everyone's forced to conform to the same narrow definition of happiness, it's hard to see how anyone could truly flourish or how society could really move forward.
Exactly. Now, having said all that about individual liberty, Mill wasn't some kind of anarchist.
Haha, right. I was going to ask about that. It's not like he was advocating for everyone to just do whatever they want with no rules or consequences.
Not at all. He understood the need for government and laws to protect individual rights and ensure a certain level of social order. He actually built upon the ideas of classical liberalism, which emphasizes limited government and individual rights.
So he was walking this fine line between advocating for individual freedom
Mm.
and recognizing the need for some kind of authority.
Precisely. He believed in the importance of things like constitutional constraints, representative democracy, and checks and balances on power.
Ah, so those are his safeguards against things like, well, the tyranny of the majority.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial concept in Mill's work. This idea that even in a democracy where the majority rules, the majority can sometimes get it wrong or even become oppressive.
Yeah. Like just because most people believe something doesn't automatically make it right or just,
Right. And Mill is really concerned about how the tyranny of the majority could stifle individual liberty and prevent progress.
that makes you think about all those times in history where the majority got it terribly wrong.
Like the trial and execution of Socrates in ancient Athens,
Exactly.
condemned by popular vote.
Or even the biblical account of Jesus condemned by the crowd in favor of Barabbas.
Powerful examples. And it really highlights how this desire to appease the majority can sometimes lead to really bad outcomes.
Yes. And for Mill, this danger wasn't limited to just the political realm.
Oh, so it's not just about like laws and government policies.
No. He believed that social pressure and the desire to conform could be just as tyrannical as any law.
Hmm. So even in a society with strong legal protections for individual rights, people can still feel pressured to conform to social norms and expectations.
Exactly. And that pressure to conform can stifle individuality, discourage critical thinking, and ultimately prevent progress.
Wow. It's like this invisible force that can box us in even when there are no laws explicitly limiting our freedom.
Precisely. And Mill was deeply concerned about the stifling effects of this kind of social tyranny.
It's almost as if we're all kind of walking on eggshells, afraid to express ourselves fully for fear of being judged or ostracized. Yeah, it's a really delicate balance, isn't it? How do you promote individual freedom without descending into chaos? How do we encourage people to be themselves without harming others or infringing on their rights?
Right. So how did Mill propose we navigate this tricky terrain? Did he offer any solutions to this dilemma?
He did, and one of his key ideas was what he called the harm principle.
Okay, the harm principle. What's
Yeah.
that all about?
Well, basically, Mill argued that the only legitimate reason for society to interfere with individual liberty is to prevent harm to others.
So it's kind of like that old saying, your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins.
Uh-huh. Exactly. It's about finding that balance point between individual freedom and the well-being of society as a whole.
But harm can be a pretty slippery concept, right?
Yeah.
Like what exactly constitutes harm? And who gets to decide?
Oh, absolutely. And Mill recognized that defining harm is a complex and evolving process. It's something that societies need to continuously debate and grapple with. He wasn't trying to offer some kind of simplistic formula, but he did provide a framework for thinking about these issues.
So it's not just about physical harm, right? Like hitting someone or stealing their property.
No. It's also about things like spreading misinformation or engaging in reckless behavior that could endanger others.
Ah, so actions that might not directly violate someone's rights, but could still have harmful consequences.
Exactly. And this is where things can get really tricky because it requires us to think not just about immediate and obvious harm, but also about potential harm or indirect harm.
Right, like what if someone's actions are offensive or upsetting to others,
Hmm.
even if they don't cause any direct physical or material harm?
That's a great question, and Mill addressed this directly. He argued that simply being offended by someone's actions or opinions, no matter how distasteful or morally objectionable we might find them, isn't sufficient grounds for limiting their freedom.
Wow. So offense or disagreement alone shouldn't be enough to justify restricting someone's liberty? That's a pretty bold statement, especially for his time.
It is. But remember, Mill was deeply concerned about the stifling effects of social conformity. He believed that a diversity of opinions and lifestyles was essential for a healthy and vibrant society.
So he wasn't just concerned about government tyranny, he was also worried about the tyranny of social pressure.
Exactly, and he saw freedom of speech and expression as a crucial safeguard against both forms of tyranny.
Ah, so that's where the marketplace of ideas comes in. The idea that the best way to combat bad ideas is not to suppress them, but to let them be challenged and debated in the open.
Precisely. Mill believed that suppressing dissenting voices, even those we find offensive or absurd, ultimately harms society.
Because it prevents us from having those tough conversations and from refining our own beliefs through rigorous debate.
Exactly. And it can also lead to a kind of intellectual stagnation where everyone's just parroting the same ideas without really thinking critically about them.
It's like we all get stuck in these echo chambers where we only hear opinions that we already agree with, and that's not good for anyone.
Not at all. Mill believed that we should actively seek out and engage with views that challenge our own assumptions, even if doing so is uncomfortable.
Yeah. It's like that quote often attributed to Voltaire, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Haha, exactly. And it's pretty remarkable to think that Mill was writing all this in a time when freedom of speech wasn't nearly as widely accepted as it is today.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate how far we've come, but also how important it is to keep fighting for these freedoms
Mm.
because they're always under threat in some way or another.
Absolutely. And it's not just about legal protections, it's also about creating a culture that values open discourse and respects diverse viewpoints.
So to recap, Mill advocated for the harm principle freedom of speech and embracing a diversity of viewpoints.
Mhm.
What else did he emphasize?
We also talked a lot about the importance of individual self-development.
Self-development. What did he mean by that?
He believed that individuals should be free to experiment with different lifestyles and pursue their own paths to happiness as long as their actions don't harm others.
Ah, so this goes back to his idea of humans as inherently progressive beings, always striving for improvement.
Precisely. And he believed that this freedom to experiment and learn from our mistakes was crucial not just for individual growth, but for societal progress as well.
I can see how that makes sense. I mean, if everyone's just conforming to the same rigid set of norms and expectations,
Yeah.
it's hard to see how anything new or innovative could ever emerge.
Right. We need individuals who are willing to challenge the status quo and explore new ways of thinking and being.
But it feels like it's getting harder and harder to do that these days with all the pressure to conform that we see in the digital age.
Especially on social media. It's like everyone's trying to present this perfect, curated image of themselves, and there's not a lot of space for authenticity or genuine self-expression.
It's a real dilemma, isn't it? How do we reconcile this need for individual self-development with the pressures to conform that are so prevalent in our hyper-connected world?
That's a question worth pondering, and it's something that Mill himself might have grappled with if he were alive today.
Definitely. But before we get too carried away with that, we still need to explore what Mill had to say about representative democracy and the potential pitfalls of majority rule. That was a major focus of his work, right?
Oh, absolutely. And his ideas on this topic are just as relevant today as they were in his time.
All right, so we've talked about individual liberty and the dangers of the tyranny of the majority. But how did Mill think we could actually prevent this tyranny from happening? Especially in a system like representative democracy, where the majority ultimately holds the power.
Well, Mill was very aware of the potential for power to corrupt even in a democratic system.
Yeah, like that famous saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right, exactly. And he believed that it was essential to have safeguards in place to prevent any one person or group from accumulating too much power.
Okay, so what did he propose? Like, what kind of safeguards did he have in mind?
Well, he was a big advocate for things like a bicameral legislature, an independent judiciary, and a free and active press.
So basically dividing power among different branches of government and making sure that there's always someone watching the watchers.
Exactly. He believed that these kinds of checks and balances were essential for preventing any one group from becoming too dominant.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But didn't Mill also believe that the quality of the people themselves played a role in all of this? It wasn't just about the systems, right?
Oh, absolutely. He actually talked about the idea of a qualified majority.
A qualified majority, what does that mean?
Well, it's a bit of a controversial idea, but essentially he was suggesting that the most educated and informed citizens should have a greater say in decision-making.
So not just a pure democracy where every vote counts equally.
Right. He was worried about the potential for an uninformed or easily swayed majority to make decisions that could harm society as a whole.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem, especially in today's world where misinformation spreads so easily online.
Exactly. It's not just about the number of votes, it's also about the quality of those votes.
Whether they're based on reason and evidence or just on emotion and prejudice.
Exactly. Now, it's important to note that Mill wasn't advocating for some kind of elitist system where only the wealthy or highly educated get to vote.
Right, that wouldn't be very democratic.
No.
Yeah.
His point was that we need to find ways to ensure that the majority is making informed and responsible decisions.
So informed and thoughtful democracy with safeguards to protect minority viewpoints, it all comes back to balancing the needs of the individual and the collective, doesn't it?
Precisely. And one of Mill's most famous ideas for achieving this balance is what he called the principle of reciprocity.
The principle of reciprocity.
Yeah.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Well, it's actually a very simple idea, but it's incredibly powerful.
Mhm.
Essentially, Mill argued that whenever we're making decisions that affect others, we should always ask ourselves, if I were in their shoes, would I be okay with this?
Wow, that's such a powerful concept. It forces you to step outside of your own perspective and consider the impact of your actions on others.
Exactly. It's a call for empathy and for putting yourself in the shoes of those who might be affected by your decisions.
It's almost like a moral litmus test for any policy or action.
I think that's a great way to put it.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored Mill's ideas about individual liberty, the dangers of the tyranny of the majority, the importance of free speech and open discourse, and the need for systems that protect the rights of all citizens, not just the most powerful. But what does all of this mean for us here and now in the 21st century? Why should we care about what some 19th century philosopher had to say?
That's a great question, and I think the answer is that Mill's ideas are timeless. They speak to fundamental questions about the nature of freedom, power, and the responsibilities of living in a free society.
Questions that are just as relevant today as they were in his time, if not more so.
Exactly. And I think his warnings about the tyranny of the majority are especially pertinent in our current climate of political polarization, cancel culture, and the echo chambers of social media.
Yeah. It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to be critical thinkers, to engage in respectful debate, and to speak up against injustice even when it's unpopular.
Absolutely. And we need to be vigilant about protecting the rights of those who hold different views and ensuring that our systems of governance are truly serving the interests of all citizens, not just the loudest voices.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the ideas of John Stuart Mill, I want to leave our listeners with this question. What resonated with you most from our conversation? What are you still wrestling with? And how can we apply Mill's insights to the challenges we face in our own lives and in the world around us?
Food for thought indeed. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the mind of one of history's most influential thinkers. Until next time, keep those minds sharp, stay curious, and never be afraid to challenge the status quo.
And don't forget to check out the show notes for links to further reading and resources on John Stuart Mill and his work. Thanks for listening.